Good day to you. My name is Daniel Wahome, and welcome to this edition of The Living Legends. And in this episode, we speak to a man who played rugby and was secretary of the federation, then known as the Kenya Rugby Football Union. He embarked on a project to document the history of the sport in Kenya. The end product is the book, 100 Years of Rugby in Kenya. And here is a copy of that book that has been launched this week. We host Zack Oloo, the author of this book. Oloo, thank you very much for being with us today on The Living Legends.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and you know the story about 100 years of rugby in Kenya, 1910 to 2010, a century of pride. It's a labor of love for him, documenting about the sport that he loves. And before we just delve into matters rugby and the history that's documented here, just about your early life, education, going through all this.
Thank you, Dan. I started my primary school in Eastland, Nairobi, in the early 60s at Dr. Kraft Primary School. I subsequently moved to Kisumu with my family, did 3 years at Kisumu Union Primary, and then I moved to Committee Primary, which is at Committee Prison in Kiambu. I did my KCP as it was at the time, and I then joined Nairobi School, which has just changed its name from the Prince of Wales. And I do recall that we joining up was by means of an interview rather than waiting for your exam results.
I mean, everyone's talking about education. How different was it about this interview vis-a-vis what we say admission to national schools, extra county schools, county schools?
Well, actually, the point is that the interview, you could pass the interview, fail your exams, and still get to the school, and vice versa. Yeah.
Well, what was that interview like? What were they looking for?
I suspect that they were looking for character. At the same time, they were looking for your academic knowledge, and they were going to do it themselves rather than rely on the examining boards.
Well, quite interesting how things have changed around that time. And the Prince of Wales, then later Nairobi School, strong rugby culture. Your introduction to that sport, how did it happen?
Okay, so you went to school, and the first term had hockey and cricket, and the second term had athletics and rugby, and the third term had soccer, and can't remember what the other game was. The point is that these were mandatory.
Must have been volleyball and because I think basketball was first term also.
Yeah. So you had to play these sports. It was not optional. So second term of 1970, we played rugby for the first time, many of us, for the first time. And it was arranged along the lines of weight and class. So we had baby calls, we had middle calls, we had senior calls, and then we had the first 15 and second 15.
Well, so there you are, breaking through to a school team. That was a process. How did you graduate through the called system?
Yes, because the baby calls was a school team. So there was 8 houses and any odd number of players gunning for a place in the baby calls. So we had about 100 first formers, and all of you are looking at 30 places for the first for the baby calls team. So you did baby calls, and the next year, if you're good enough, you graduated middle calls, then you went to senior calls, then a few dazzlers moved straight from middle calls to the first 15.
Well, so I mean, they would skip it. I mean, in your time, anybody you would remember vividly who skipped the senior calls part?
I remember, for example, Joe Masiga, who then went on to play for Kenya national team, both soccer and rugby. And by third form, he was already the first 15.
Now that you brought it up, it was quite interesting. I think Stanley Ramogo was the captain of rugby. Joe Masiga was the captain of football.
Football, yes.
But it ended up that they're more famous for the
the other way
the other way around.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it's just one of these odd things in life. I do recall that both of them actually were my players. I was the football captain in 1973, And Joe Masiga was a forward, and Stan Oburu Ramogo was a midfielder with me. And Joe was special because he'd score the goals. And therefore, I was not surprised that he did very well in soccer, although he was equally powerful in rugby.
Well, well, Joe Masiga, one of a few men to have played at international level for Kenya in rugby and in football. Now, let's talk about some of the successes you remember and the rivalries with Lenana School, St. Mary's RVA.
Yeah, well, during my time, you know, playing RVA was a second 15 affair, and but Lenana School was a big day, particularly in rugby, and in my years at Nairobi School, unfortunately, they always seemed to best us, and this only improved later on. But in our years, they had the stars. We had good players, but they had incredible players. I mean, they had people like John Akatsa, they had people like Eddie Onginjo, they had people like Nick Kado, and before that there had been John Mohato. They were just Cliff Mukulu. They were just impossible for us. So we only scored the rare victory in the 6 years that I was.
And that is the story of school rugby. But now, coming into the sport and the book that you've done, 100 Years of Rugby in Kenya, we say it came by ship, but what's the story of the sport coming to the country?
It literally came by ship because the first games that were played in Kenya were played in Mombasa and it was normally a game between settlers here and a ship that came to shore. And the best example is the Enterprise Cup, which was actually given to Kenyan Rugby by the HMS Enterprise, which was a British ship that landed in Mombasa. So it landed in Mombasa and very quickly spread up country through the railway. And then there was this little eddy of Boers coming into the country and heading for Eldoret because that was their preferred location. And they had a very strong tradition of rugby. And they started playing rugby in Eldoret and Kitale and that particular hinterland. And you'll find that the effect of that was the very curious thing that the first Kenyan indigenous team in 1981 had 5 from Kitale. And that was very strange. Yeah.
It wasn't a Nairobi affair as people would say.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about the Enterprise Cup, actually third oldest tournament in the country after the Tana Hill Shield, the Easter Golf tournament played at Royal Nairobi, and the Sekafa Senior Challenge Cup, which started off as Kenya versus Uganda, a railway tournament. This was the main tournament, and actually Eldoret winning it way back 1947, Kitale in 67. The involvement of East Africa, Uganda, 68, 69, 70. That was Kampala. And the West Kenya Oribis. Looking at this period in time, what were the main growth points of Kenyan rugby?
Well, you have to remember that during that time, rugby was not merely a Nairobi game. And you found rugby in places like Kisii, you found rugby in Machakos, you found rugby in most parts of the Rift Valley. So you had towns like Kitale, Eldoret, they all had teams. And therefore, the concentration was not so much in Nairobi. And the Enterprise Cup actually was the best demonstration of this state of affairs. We also actually had teams coming in from Tanzania. So we had Arusha, we had Dar es Salaam, we had Moshi. And so the rugby was a bit more spread out than it later became. And there were reasons why it then collapsed, as it were, into a purely Nairobi affair. So much so that by 1976, there was only 3 teams playing in the Nairobi District Cup. And those were Impala, Nondis, and Harlequins.
Well, yeah, the 3 clubs, and actually Nondis and the Nairobi club had the Congonis. What was the story that happened with them?
Well, you know, Congonis then, It was both. It had various aspects it had cricket, it had rugby, and it had other sport. But cricket seemed to have then taken over and become the dominant sport for Congolese.
Well, there you've had it. The story of that with Zack Oloo, who's written a book, 100 Years of Kenyan Rugby, A Century of Pride, looking at rugby from 1910 to 2010. Now, let's take a look at the emergence of indigenous clubs. And the first one we think about is Mean Machine. And also just give us the etymology of that name, because it has a story behind it.
Okay, so Mean Machine, the University of Nairobi team, actually started playing in earlier than most people realize, and indeed in the university games, East African University Games of 1975 was won by University of Nairobi, then known as UON.
Yes.
And subsequently, when a lot of players exited the university, sorry, not joined the university. A lot of the players from Nairobi School and Lenana School joined the university in 1975. They then went on to form a team for 1977. And that team was University of Nairobi, but they had an experience. They had an experience that gave them the name Mean Machine. And that was a movie that was shot in the US some time back. And it was about prisoners and how they put together a team to play against the warders. And the movie was known as Mean Machine. And that's where they get the name. So in 1977, they play for the first time in Kenya Cup. They win it. The Mean Machine was entrenched.
And what about that slogan they have, Estuma Absolute?
Estuma Absolute is something that I have never really related to. Because I wasn't at the University of Nairobi. So I never played for Mean Machine. But I do realize that it has a certain significance to do with you know how strong the typical lawyer man was.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's where it came from, because the language itself is lawyer.
Esichuma, strong metal. And then Mwamba. Let's talk about what you call what you say in your book is the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
The formation of Mwamba, but there was also Miro.
Yes. So these guys who joined the university played for Mean Machine. 3 years later, they are leaving. There's a very large number of them. And there's also people coming out of Black Blood who had also been formed in the interim period.
That is Black Blood, Kenyatta University.
That's Kenyatta University. And these people got to go somewhere. They don't want to go to the main clubs. Some of them may have suffered a certain level of discrimination after school. Before joining university, they went to Impalas, they went to the nondescripts of this world, they went to Kenya Harlequins. And Chris Jenga does allude to it in the book. He actually states it, that they needed somewhere where they could go and operate as indigenous players. So Mwamba is formed by these very guys. So many of them came out of the university at that time. Some of the more notable ones were Justus Muga. He was at the founding of Mwamba. They had people like Fred Ojiambo. You had people like Frank Ojiambo. You had people like Tom Okech. So they actually set up Mwamba, established Mwamba.
Mwamba itself, the impact that it had. Actually, you played for Mwamba before your career was cut short. Going on to win that Kenya Cup, what was that moment for Mwamba? A young club, 100% indigenous players.
It was an incredible moment and led to many good things, because it opened up the eyes of younger players that they could come to indigenous clubs and make it work out. And you know, Mwamba was a self-supporting club. Mwamba played its rugby within the city center. And therefore, a lot
Actually,
of the
place now is known as a Green Park Terminus.
That's
Railway
correct.
Club.
That's correct. So the younger players who could not find the time and resources to go to the bigger clubs who are in the suburbs of the city found it very convenient to play at Mwamba. And after the game, you walk into town and catch your transport. So it was a moment of discovery for many players who, in fact, Mwamba got players who had never played rugby before, and they came and played rugby at Mwamba.
And the story of Mwamba players and all that, let's talk about now sevens, because Mwamba had this, brand of rugby that came up. You'd have to go back to around 84, 85, 86. There was this group of people who came together, Watembezi Pesetas.
Yeah.
And went played in Dubai and eventually got an invitation to Hong Kong. Yeah. What's the story of the Watembezi Pesetas? Actually, you've been their chair.
Yes, that's right. Watembezi Pesetas started off as a bunch of guys who used to play together in the Ngong Road clubs. And they decided that they would set up a team that would go and play rugby outside the country. But the genesis was one Cliff Mukulu working in Dubai in 1982. And he got to meet up with the Dubai Exiles, yes, where there was an international tournament that was being played. And he offered to bring a team from Kenya. So 82, they go off. They do reasonably well. 83, they go and win. 84, they go and win. And that established Kenya's credentials as a rugby playing nation, a sevens playing nation, because arising from there, they were then invited to Hong Kong Sevens in 1986. In the meantime, now that you mentioned Mwamba, in 1984, Mwamba won all the sevens tournaments in the country.
Yes.
And the dominance was such that at the Gestetna Sevens, which was played in Parklands in those days, Mwamba B actually beat Mwamba A to win the tournament.
Well, pieces of history, I mean, everyone wouldn't know. I mean, I think there was a story of, I think the same case with Nondis at one point.
Yeah.
The two Nondi sides, yes, clashing in the final, I think.
That's
78
right.
or something.
Yeah, that would be the 15s now.
That would be the 15s.
Yeah,
in
Nondis,
the Kenya
Ruffians and Nondis.
And moving on, this culture of sevens, it grew, and eventually sometime, maybe around 95, 96, the rugby patrons came together and created the Safari Sevens.
Yeah.
What's the story of this tournament that, captured people?
Yeah.
And 27 years on, when you hear the sevens, you just know this is one to look out for.
Yes, I'll take you a bit back. Before the Safari Sevens, Watembezi Pesetas had toured globally. And basically they were touring as a sevens playing side. So from 1990 to 1996, they had been doing the Singapore Sevens.
Yeah.
And did reasonably well. In fact, they did so well that in 1990, Eddie Rombo was voted the most valuable player. And that ahead of the Scottish captain at the time, Gavin Hastings, who is an absolute legend. Rombo did better than him. So our sevens credentials were set. And kudos to the Rugby Football RFUEA officials who at that time included John Lloyd, it included Robin Cahill, it included George Kariuki, that they, and Dennis Awori, they had the foresight to look at this seven situation and say, can we not translate this into a Kenyan tournament that attracts equally the world? And mind you, at the time, Rugby Sevens was actually coming up as, and still is, one of the fastest growing games on earth. And that's why it subsequently accepted at the Olympics.
Yes.
In 1993, I remember attending the inaugural Rugby World Cup Sevens in Scotland. And that gave it a fillip. After that, Rugby Sevens just exploded. And our guys here looked at it and said, let's do a tournament. And it was led by Robin Cahill. And they set up Safari Sevens. And indeed, it did not disappoint. It went on to become easily the most famous tournament, rugby tournament in the country and possibly in Africa.
Well, and guess what? One of the persons he's mentioned here was invited, Gavin Hastings, and he was shocked at, I remember, I think I was listening to radios in campus, and he said, I'd never seen rugby posts this tall. These posts are up there. And actually, by the way, somewhere at the back of this book, and he's going to read it later, we're going to find out about some place in Kenya people don't know about, and also about the rugby posts there. Now let's talk about 15s. You know, Kenya has played the British Lions, but today we can't get close. If we were to play the British and Irish Lions, I think they use a school system where you get to 62, game comes to a close. Yeah. But what's the story of 15s?
15s is a highly technical game. It's also grown, players have grown bigger. Mm-hmm. It's extremely demanding. And in the earlier days, we had, and this was basically a white game. And a lot of the white players were from the farming areas. Mm-hmm. They were bigger than our boys, our black boys were. Mm-hmm. And they were able to, and a lot of them had also learned rugby abroad. Uh-huh. When they were from their home countries. So they were able to hold their own against the British Lions, who first visited us in 1953. And the scores were nothing to write home about, were 50 to 13 or something like that. And they came again subsequently, and again the scores were reasonable. We had South Africa, the Springboks mm-hmm. passed through here. We had Wales. And all the time, the scores were nothing to write home about. They were not 100-1 or anything like that. Today, if we played the British Lions, I shudder to think what it'd be like. Simply because our 15s game has not developed to the extent that theirs has. Mm-hmm. So the gap has grown bigger, simply because of professionalism. The game is professional out there. Here it's still amateur.
And I think one of the biggest stories came about in 1985. Kenya playing against Zimbabwe, and you know, winning against Zimbabwe at that time was the same as if Harambee Stars go and beat a team like Argentina in football.
Absolutely, it was the first time we'd ever won against Zimbabwe, and that was a major coup. In fact, after that, things have never been the same again for Zimbabwe, mm-hmm. because we had come of age, and unfortunately they were slipping.
And looking forward, I mean, when the team that played Zimbabwe, maybe with the exception of, I think, the late Absalom Bimbo Mutere, there was the late Jimmy Green Owino, but it was good to see their families there, getting to see them honored at the Victoria Cup. What was that moment for your generation of players?
It was an incredible moment, and I do remember that two guys were actually represented by their sons, who have never had a prouder moment in their lives, and that was Agre Wimbo and Deva Wimbo. Their sons actually represented them. That is one of the pictures in this book that we cherish, because it showed recognition of those who had got us where we are.
Now let's talk about spreading the game to the country. You mentioned Black Blood Kenyatta University. That was it was a teaching college. I know previously you've hosted Dr. Michael Tanko Tieno here, and he told the story. But at that point, when you were serving with the union, you saw the initiative of the teachers to try spread the game. Such in the 90s, we started seeing Njoro, Nakuru, then suddenly Kakamega winning the national titles. Yeah. What was the contribution of these teachers?
It was immense. It really was. And so these guys got together towards the end of the 80s and decided that because they were going to be posted all over the country, they were the right people to spread the game. And fortunately for them, they had a listening ear at the union. One Samagutu was treasurer, and they listened to them and put forward a case to the union, and we did some funding. It was modest, very modest funding, but again, they were very modest people. They were prepared to spread the game at a very nominal cost, quite often at a cost to themselves more than anything else. And I do remember some of the stories, some of the reports they filed were absolutely horrifying. For example, going to Cardinal Otunga, and the headmaster said, no, you cannot hold a clinic here. And they walked out on a Saturday morning. And they walked out, and on the way out, at the gate, the boys came running. They said, it's okay, come back, we've convinced him. So that sort of story, it was amazing the stuff that they went through.
Any other you could pick up, you would remember, apart from Cardinal Lutunga Mosocho?
No, that was the most outstanding one. There were others, but small time.
Well, students saying we want to play, and there it is. Career opportunities through rugby. We've seen Edward Rombo played rugby league as he studied law in the UK. Eric Kibe is there, Humphrey Kayange, William Barker, Collins Injera. Those are the ones that mentioned. What's the story you've seen around this?
The one thing I have to point out is that up to about the 90s, up to the early 90s, most rugby players in this country were fairly successful people in their professions. They were almost all professionals.
You are one of them.
Well, thank you very much. I may not have been as successful as the others. But it's only when people like Mwamba came on board, as I said earlier, we started accepting boys who had not played rugby before. And they were from all walks of life. And therefore, it became necessary to find a way to keep them in rugby. And at the same time, they had to make a living. And fortunately, this was now possible because of the spread of the game. It has not gone as far as we would like it to go, but people like Eddie Rombo, people like Humphrey Kayange, people like Collins Injera, I'm not saying they made a living out of it, but they were able to cut out a fairly decent lifestyle while at the same time playing rugby. We still haven't had professional rugby as such. Eddie Rombo and Eric Kibe went out there and played. William Barker played a couple of seasons. Oscar Osir and Ben Aimba went and played for Cornish Pirates for a year or two. But the only people who really made a living out of it were Eddie Rombo and Eric Kibe. We're still hoping that going forward, we will have a situation where our boys are making a living from playing rugby.
Now, as we conclude, let me hand the book to you. I know you've mentioned to me some excerpt that you'd like to give to us.
Yes, I'd like to read the back, which I think encapsulates what this book is about. It's 100 years of rugby in Kenya, the origins, development, and history of the game in East Africa Territory and Kenya in particular is documented in snippets in a variety of publications and remains largely unavailable to the rugby enthusiast and the Kenyan sportsman or historian. The rugby administrator struggles to trace the history of development of the game, including past fixtures results, while the younger Kenyan enthusiast lacks informative reference on the game in past days. In any easily accessible form, the game is much the poorer for it. So there exists a serious gap in documenting the history of the game in the region and Kenya in particular, as no definitive version has been written, compiled, and published to date. Major pillars of the game are disappearing with the memories of the glory days of yore, and pioneers may soon be lost to the present and future enthusiasts. The concepts and records of outgoings and incoming tours, including the visits by the famed Rich Lions, may soon be lost. These shores have been visited by tens of colorful sides, while we have sent out many tours, including pioneering seventh sides. The interesting saga of the changing structure of the administration of the game, the competitions and the clubs is also a subject that needs to be recorded for posterity. As examples, it is unimaginable and incredible to many present-day enthusiasts to learn that nondescript's RFC were based at Parklands Club from inception in 1912 up to 1998. That Mwamba RFC was formed by the stalwarts of the first Mean Machine RFC side that won the Kenya Cup in 1977 and was the declaration of independence of the African rugby player. That the tallest rugby posts outside South Africa are to be found standing at Nandi Bears Club, a fact that is today known to none but a few aficionados. So the book is a result of research and record of the development of the game through the last 100 years and includes the best photos, insights from interviews with legends of the game, snippets of articles by renowned rugby reporters and writers, testimonials, anecdotes, and real-life stories of rugby lovers in East Africa, in a lively narration of the history of the game with utmost fidelity to fact. The book contains fixtures played by Kenya 15 in the period and other statistics. So this is all rendered into a hardcover, comfortable book, format that throbs with life and color, inviting the reader to come back again and again.
Thank you very much. And there you have it, 100 years of Kenyan rugby in Kenya, 1910 to 2010, a century of pride. And this is by Zack Oloo, launched this week. And congratulations for the book launch.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Ziggy Marley has a song known as Tomorrow People. In the song, he asks, tomorrow people, where is your past? And I would like to paraphrase this. Kenya's future sports stars, specifically Kenya's future rugby stars, do you know your past so that you can have a real great future?
And Bob Marley says, we know where we're coming from, we know where we're going.
Right. Father and son, musical family, giving us the quotes for this. This book has been authored by Zack Oloo, and thank you very much for being our guest on The Living Legends.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you very much for being with us. Have a good day. I am Daniel Wahome.